Nobody was supposed to survive that night, and for 5 men, nobody did. That single truth has lived in the chest of one man for over 3 decades, locked behind a security clearance that still hasn't fully expired, buried beneath a life that looks ordinary from the outside, but carries the weight of something most people will never understand. His name is Sergeant Marcus Hale. And what happened to him in those mountains, on that moonless night, in a country that officially had no American soldiers present, is one of the most extraordinary stories of individual survival, courage, and heartbreak that the military world has ever produced, and almost nobody knows it exists. The year was 1994. The geopolitical landscape was a chessboard being played by invisible hands, and somewhere in the middle of it all, a network of Allied intelligence operatives was on the verge of complete collapse. A source, known only as CARDINAL, had been feeding critical information to Western intelligence agencies for nearly 4 years. His identity was protected at the highest levels. His information had prevented at least 2 major regional conflicts from escalating into something far worse. He was, by every measure, irreplaceable. And now he had gone silent. 3 days of silence, which in the intelligence world doesn't mean someone forgot to check in. 3 days of silence means something has gone terribly wrong, and every hour that passes makes the situation more dangerous, more volatile, and more likely to end in catastrophe. The decision to send a team was made at a level so high that only 4 people in the entire government knew it was happening. There would be no official authorization, no written orders, no mission file that could be subpoenaed, leaked, or discovered. The soldiers chosen for this operation would carry nothing that identified them as American, nothing that connected them to any branch of the military, and nothing that would allow a foreign government to make a diplomatic case if things went sideways. They were, on paper, ghosts. In reality, they were 6 of the most capable human beings their country had ever produced, asked to walk into a situation that the analysts privately believed had less than a 30% chance of successful resolution. Marcus Hale received his briefing at 0400 hours in a basement room of a building he had never been inside before and would never enter again. The officer who briefed him, a man Hale knew only as Colonel Straker, had the kind of face that had stopped showing emotion sometime in the previous decade. He slid a photograph across the table without preamble. The photograph showed a compound, stone walls, 2 guard towers, a single road in and out, and forest on 3 sides. "Cardinal is inside," Straker said. "We believe he's still alive. We believe he hasn't been broken yet. You have a window of approximately 18 hours before that changes." He paused, and in that pause Hale heard everything that wasn't being said. "You leave at 2200. You go in as 6. You come out with Cardinal. Whatever happens in between does not happen. Do you understand?" Hale understood. He had understood that kind of language his entire career. It meant, "You are on your own, and if this fails, we will not come for you." He spent the hours between the briefing and departure doing what he always did before a mission that felt different from the others. He sat quietly, ate slowly, and thought about every person he was doing this for. Not in an abstract, patriotic way. In a specific, faces and names way. His sister in Portland, who called every Sunday. The family of the man 2 doors down from him on base, whose kid had just started walking. The analyst who had handed him the initial intelligence report with shaking hands, because she knew what it meant to ask someone to go to a place she would never go herself. He thought about Cardinal, a man he had never met, who had been living a double life for 4 years, feeding information to people who couldn't publicly acknowledge his existence, who had almost certainly known from the beginning that this was how it might end. Hale felt something for that man that he couldn't quite name, a kinship, maybe, between people who operate in the spaces that the official version of events doesn't include. The team assembled at 21:30. 6 men in a hangar that smelled of aviation fuel and cold concrete. Hale knew 4 of them personally and the 5th by reputation. Staff Sergeant Daniel Reyes, the youngest of the group at 26, quiet in the way that genuinely dangerous people are quiet, with eyes that were always calculating distances and angles. Sergeant First Class Tommy Briggs, a broad-shouldered man from Tennessee who had been on more classified operations than most people knew existed, who communicated primarily through expressions and had a gift for reading terrain that Hale had never seen matched. Warrant Officer James Ghost Kowalski, the team's intelligence specialist, so named because of his ability to move through populated areas completely unnoticed, who had spent 6 months in the region the year before and spoke the local language with an accent that could fool native speakers. Master Sergeant Ray Okafor, the medic, a calm and methodical man who approached violence with the same detached precision he brought to emergency surgery, and who Hale had once watched save a man's life using nothing but a field kit and absolute composure. And Sergeant Luis Vega, the demolitions expert, a man who smiled more than anyone else on the team and used humor as the specific mechanism by which he processed fear, which meant that the more dangerous the situation, the funnier Vega became. They did not make speeches. They did not shake hands dramatically or exchange meaningful words about honor and country. They checked their equipment with methodical thoroughness, confirmed communications protocols, reviewed the extraction route one final time, and loaded into the transport in silence. That silence was its own kind of language, a shared understanding that words would be inadequate for what they were about to do, and that the bond between them didn't require expression to be real. Hale looked around at these 5 men and felt the specific weight of responsibility that comes with leading people you genuinely respect into a situation where you cannot guarantee their safety. It was the heaviest feeling he knew. He had never found a way to make it lighter. They were inserted by helicopter 40 kilometers from the target, landing in a clearing so small that the pilot's hands were shaking when they touched down. From there, they moved on foot through terrain that seemed designed specifically to exhaust and disorient. Dense forest broken by rocky outcroppings, elevation changes that punished the knees and lungs, and a ground cover of dead leaves that made silence a constant, exhausting negotiation between speed and stealth. The temperature had dropped sharply after midnight, and the rain that had been threatening since they landed finally arrived around 0130, not as a dramatic downpour, but as the persistent, soaking kind that gets inside everything and turns the world cold and gray and miserable. Hale was grateful for it. Rain meant noise cover. Rain meant reduced visibility for the patrols they knew were operating in this area. Rain was the friend of the man who needed to remain invisible. They moved in staggered formation, each man 5 meters from the next, each responsible for a specific arc of coverage, communicating through hand signals that had been practiced until they were reflex rather than thought. Hale was at the point, Kowalski directly behind him with the intelligence feeds, Reyes and Vega covering the flanks, Briggs and Okafor at the rear. The pace was deliberately slow, faster than instinct wanted, slower than anxiety demanded, because Hale had learned over years of night operations that the teams who rushed were the teams who made noise, and the teams who made noise were the teams who didn't come home. Every 50 meters, he stopped for 30 seconds. Listened. Let the forest settle around them. Looked for the specific kind of stillness that meant they were alone, rather than the kind that meant something else was also listening. At approximately 0215, Kowalski touched Hale's shoulder, the signal for stop and observe. Hale froze, raised a fist, and the entire team halted simultaneously. Kowalski moved silently to Hale's side and pointed northeast. Hale looked and saw it, the faint orange glow of a cigarette, barely visible through the trees, roughly 80 meters away. A patrol, moving slowly, parallel to their route. Hale counted. 2 men, based on the movement pattern. Armed, based on the silhouettes. He looked at Kowalski, who held up 2 fingers and made a circular motion. 2 guards, rotating patrol, probably part of a larger pattern. Hale made a decision in 4 seconds that in any other context would have required a committee and a written recommendation. He pointed left. They would adjust their route by 200 meters west, accept the additional time cost, and avoid contact entirely. The mission was extraction, not engagement. Every shot fired was a liability. Kowalski nodded. The team moved left like water, finding a new path, smooth and silent and inevitable. They reached the outer perimeter of the compound at 0340. Through night vision, Hale could see exactly what the satellite photographs had shown. Stone walls approximately 4 meters high, 2 guard towers at the northeast and southwest corners, a single gate on the eastern face with 2 guards in permanent position, and lights in 2 of the interior buildings suggesting occupancy. What the photographs hadn't shown was the additional patrol that moved along the outside of the western wall on a pattern Hale estimated at roughly 12 minutes per circuit. He watched 2 full cycles to confirm the timing, then signaled Briggs, who crawled forward and spent 4 minutes examining the base of the wall through a monocular before crawling back and pressing 2 fingers into Hale's palm. A prearranged signal, meaning there was a blind spot, and he knew where it was. Getting over the wall took 11 minutes of the most focused, adrenaline-saturated work Hale had ever done. Briggs went first, using a grappling hook wrapped in cloth to eliminate the metallic sound, pulling himself over with a smoothness that belied the weight of his gear. Then Reyes. Then Vega, who made it to the top of the wall and paused just long enough to look back at Hale with an expression that said, as clearly as words, "Can you believe we're actually doing this?" Then Okafor. Then Kowalski. Hale went last, pulling the rope up behind him, dropping into the compound's interior, and pressing himself against the inner wall while his eyes adjusted and his heart rate came back from wherever it had gone. Kowalski had studied the compound layout obsessively for the 18 hours before deployment and had memorized it with the kind of precision that made Hale grateful, once again, that this particular man was on this particular team. He led them through the compound's interior with a confidence that was almost unsettling, moving between pools of shadow, avoiding the light spill from the occupied buildings, navigating to a low stone structure on the north side that the intelligence assessment had identified as the most likely holding location for a high-value detainee. The door was secured with a padlock that Vega defeated in under 40 seconds using tools that Hale had never fully understood and had long since stopped asking about. Inside, the darkness was absolute. Hale moved in first, sweeping with a shielded flashlight, and in the narrow beam of that light, he saw a man sitting against the far wall with his hands bound behind him, his face obscured by a hood, his breathing shallow but present. Hale crossed the room in 3 steps, removed the hood with careful hands, and looked into the face of Cardinal for the first time. The man was older than his file photographs suggested, not in years, but in the specific way that fear and isolation and the knowledge of imminent death ages a person from the inside. His eyes, when they adjusted to the light and found Hale's face, filled with something so raw and unguarded that Hale had to look away for a moment. It was relief. Pure. Total. The kind that comes from being in darkness so long that light itself becomes almost unbearable. Kowalski cut the binding, helped Cardinal to his feet, and began the quiet, rapid assessment of his condition. Bruised. Dehydrated. A cut above his left eye that had been inadequately treated. But ambulatory. Functional. Capable of movement. Hale allowed himself exactly 3 seconds of something that felt like hope before he heard the sound that every soldier in that situation fears most. A shout, from outside, in a language that didn't need translation. Someone had found something. Someone knew something was wrong. What followed happened with the terrible speed of things that have been carefully planned for and still managed to go wrong in ways that no plan anticipated. The team moved out of the holding structure and immediately encountered a guard who had not been part of any patrol pattern they had observed, a variable they had no intelligence on, in a position that shouldn't have existed. Reyes dealt with the guard in 3 seconds with a professionalism that Hale would never entirely be comfortable with, but had long since stopped questioning. But the shouting outside was getting louder. A light came on in the main building. Then another. The 12-minute patrol cycle that had been so reliable was suddenly meaningless because something had triggered a general alert and the compound was waking up. Hale made the call to move to the extraction point immediately, abandon the careful, methodical pace of insertion and replace it with controlled speed, which is the military equivalent of the difference between walking a tightrope and running across it. They moved back through the compound in a formation that was faster and therefore louder and therefore more dangerous. Cardinal between Kowalski and Okafor, Hale and Reyes at the front, Briggs and Vega at the rear covering their withdrawal. They reached the western wall at the exact moment that the compound's exterior lights came on, flooding the space with a harsh, white illumination that destroyed every advantage the darkness had given them. The explosion of gunfire came from 3 directions at once, which told Hale in an instant what his brain had been refusing to fully process since the moment the shouting started. This wasn't a random discovery. This was coordinated. This was planned. Someone had known they were coming, had known their route, had known their timing, and had positioned forces accordingly. The ambush was not opportunistic. It was prepared. And in the white-lit chaos of the compound's exterior, with muzzle flashes tearing through the night from the guard towers and from positions outside the wall that should have been empty. Hale understood with a cold, nauseating clarity that someone on the inside had talked. He shouted the emergency protocol, a single word that every member of the team knew meant scatter, survive, reach the secondary extraction point if possible. And then the world became a sequence of moments so compressed and violent and loud that it stopped feeling like reality and started feeling like something that was happening to someone else. He saw Reyes go down to his left, hit and falling with the specific, total collapse that means the body has stopped cooperating. He saw Vega returning fire from behind a stone wall with the focused intensity of a man who has made peace with what is happening even as he fights against it. He lost sight of Briggs and Okafor in the smoke and noise and movement. He grabbed Cardinal by the arm and ran, not toward the gate, not toward the wall they had come over, but toward the northern perimeter where his map memory told him there was a drainage channel that ran under the wall and into the forest, an exit that wasn't an exit, that no tactical assessment would have identified as a viable route, because it required a man to crawl through 40 meters of narrow, water-filled darkness to reach the other side. He went through that channel with Cardinal behind him, pulling the man forward through water that was black and cold and tasted of metal, keeping one hand on the stone ceiling above him to maintain direction, unable to see anything, unable to hear anything except the muffled chaos above and the sound of his own breathing inside a space so small it felt like the earth itself was closing around him. He had never experienced fear quite like that. Not the sharp, adrenaline-electric fear of combat, but the slow, suffocating fear of complete sensory deprivation in a place from which there might be no exit, with a man behind him whose survival depended entirely on Hale's ability to keep moving forward when every instinct in his body was screaming to stop. They came out the other side into cold air and rain and the sound of gunfire that was now behind them and slightly above, which meant the compound, which meant distance, which meant they were outside the immediate kill zone. Hale pulled Cardinal out of the drainage channel and kept moving without pausing, because pausing was how you died, and he was not going to die here, not like this, not without knowing what had happened to his team. He moved north through the forest using nothing but memory and the compass that was the only piece of equipment that had survived the scramble completely intact, with Cardinal keeping pace behind him in a silence that Hale recognized as the silence of a man who has decided to trust someone completely because the alternative is unthinkable. For the next 4 hours, Marcus Hale did something that military analysts who later reviewed the partial, heavily redacted account of the mission described as tactically improbable and physically extraordinary. He moved 17 kilometers through hostile territory, in the dark, in the rain, with a wounded shoulder that had taken a fragment sometime during the chaos at the compound, and that he didn't fully register as injured until he stopped moving and his body had the opportunity to reassert its complaints. He avoided 3 separate patrol groups using a combination of terrain reading, sound discipline, and the specific kind of improvised decision-making that cannot be trained and cannot be taught. It can only be earned through years of doing this, of learning the language of dangerous environments and developing the ability to read what a forest is telling you about who else is in it. He moved with Cardinal through a landscape that was trying to kill them both, and he did not stop, and he did not falter, and he did not allow himself to process what he had left behind in that compound until he had done the thing he had come here to do. They reached the secondary extraction point at 0724, just as the sky was beginning to shift from black to the deep, uncertain gray that precedes dawn. The retrieval team, 2 men in civilian clothes with a vehicle that looked like it belonged to a local agricultural business, were still there, which meant the window hadn't closed, which meant something had gone right even in a night where almost everything had gone wrong. When Hale stepped out of the tree line with Cardinal behind him, both retrieval team members stopped moving for a moment, not because they hadn't been expecting someone, because they clearly hadn't been expecting anyone, and the sight of a man emerging from a forest that had been erupting with gunfire hours earlier, wounded and mud-covered, and still moving with the deliberate purpose of someone who has decided that stopping is not an acceptable option, produced in them the kind of silence that is really a form of respect. Cardinal was evacuated within the hour. The intelligence he carried, not just what was in his head, but documents he had managed to conceal throughout his detention, sewn into the lining of his jacket with a needle and thread that Hale still finds remarkable when he thinks about it. The quiet, desperate ingenuity of a man who knew that his information might outlast him proved to be among the most significant intelligence assets recovered in that decade. Analysts who reviewed it described the material as potentially having prevented a regional conflict that could have drawn in multiple NATO members. The specific details remain classified. The people who were protected by what Cardinal carried out of that compound will never know his name or what he sacrificed to preserve it. The mission was buried so completely that the official record doesn't contain a gap where it should be. The paperwork was constructed to suggest that nothing had happened at all, which is a more sophisticated form of concealment than simply removing a file. Hale was transferred to a different posting within 72 hours. He was seen by a military surgeon for his shoulder under a cover story that has never been examined too closely. He wrote 5 letters, one for each man he had left in that compound, and sealed them in envelopes that he has carried with him for 30 years because he has never found a way to send them that felt adequate to what they contained. He received no medal, no official recognition, no ceremony of any kind. What he received, some months later, was a brief, handwritten note from a man whose name he didn't recognize, which said only, "The work was not wasted. The people are safe. We know what it cost." He has kept that note. It is, in his words, the only piece of paper from that period of his life that tells the truth. The question of who betrayed the mission has never been officially answered. Hale has his own conclusion, arrived at over years of quiet analysis and conversations that couldn't happen through official channels. He doesn't share it publicly. He says only that the answer, if it were ever confirmed, would be more complicated and more painful than people expect, and that some truths do more damage in the open than they do buried, which is perhaps the most honestly military thing that any soldier has ever said. What remains, when everything classified has been stripped away and everything that can be said has been said, is the image of one man crawling through darkness and mud and cold water, wounded and alone, moving forward because the mission required it, and because 5 men who trusted him were counting on him to finish what they had all started together. That image is not heroic in the way that movies understand heroism. It is not dramatic or triumphant or clean. It is simply one person, in the worst possible circumstances, making the decision to keep going when every reasonable argument pointed toward stopping. And in that decision, unremarked upon, unrecognized, unknown to almost everyone alive, lies something that might be the truest definition of courage that exists, not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let fear be the last word. Marcus Hale is in his 60s now. He lives quietly. He tends a garden. He calls his sister every Sunday without fail. He does not talk about the mission, but he does not pretend it didn't happen, and there is a difference between those two things that matters enormously to him. When asked, on the rare occasions when someone who knows enough to ask approaches him carefully with the question whether he regrets going, he is always quiet for a long moment before answering. And then he says the same thing, every time, in the same steady voice that has spent a lifetime not flinching. "I regret what it cost. I don't regret the choice." Some sacrifices will never be celebrated because celebrating them would mean admitting how desperate things truly were, and how close the edge really was, and how many people slept safely in their beds that night because 6 men walked into a darkness they couldn't fully see the bottom of. 5 of those men never walked out. One did, and he has carried all 6 of them, every single day, for 30 years, in his silence, in his garden, in the letters he has never sent, and in the choice he makes each morning to keep living as a man who knows the weight of what he did and has decided, against everything, to find it worth carrying. And somewhere right now, in a room with no windows and no record, another soldier is looking at another photograph sliding across another table. And that story is one you are not going to want to miss. If this moved you, subscribe to the channel, because the next mission goes even deeper, costs even more, and has been buried even longer than this one.